Hey guys, I want to deal with the issue of tithing. Are Christians required to give a tithe or 10% of their income to the local church? What does the Bible say? That's important. There are good Christians who have disagreed on this issue. It is a secondary issue, and so I don't believe it should be an issue in argument, yet I believe it is very important. I was just talking to a guy today at a Christian bookstore who was telling me that his pastor sent him a letter in the mail with an envelope saying that he's not tithing enough. He's not giving enough to the local church. And I've been to churches visiting one time, and in a small local church here, that the pastor's wife came up to me and said, here's our envelope to give. And I remember being very turned off. I was there to worship and fellowship, and I felt very pressured to give. And, money can be a very divisive issue in the church. Money can really push people away and hinder the furtherance of the gospel. And Paul, we see in Corinthians especially, he would remove any of those cultural barriers, and he wanted to remove anything that would hinder the gospel from spreading, which is one reason why he didn't even take a paycheck from the church of Corinth there, because he didn't want that to be an issue. He worked with his own hands and to provide for himself so he can preach the gospel to them freely. And so, what does the Bible say? Those who believe that we are to give and required to give 10% to the local church today, they don't have a verse in the New Testament to use because it's just not there. And what they fail to understand completely and logically is we are not under law, that we are not under the old covenant that God gave to Israel through Moses, those required commands to live as Jews there in the land of Israel. We are not under that law. We are under the law of Christ. We are under the new covenant, not the old covenant. It was required in the old covenant to give a tenth and to give to the priest in the temple there. But it was also they required to give their offerings, and that they have the temple tax. You have the redeeming of the firstborn, your first fruits, and these sacrifices that you were to offer on top of giving. And so they're what they were required to give under law was actually more than 10%. Some will say it's more around 20%. That they were required, and if they did not, they were in sin. And yet people today will use verses from Malachi chapter 3 saying, will a man rob God? Yet you have robbed him. How? By not giving of your tithes and offerings. And there are people, preachers, pastors, teachers teaching that verse today and applying it to the church in New Covenant, saying you must give 10%. If you don't, you are robbing God. And yet when you look at the context there, it's referring to tithes and offerings, referring to the sacrifices. And so they're ripping a verse out of context to apply to Christians. Context is king when we study the Bible. We got to understand context. There were certain commands given to Israel that do not apply to the church today. And so I believe to put Christians under the bondage saying that you must give 10% or you're in sin is very wrong. I don't think it's a divisive issue, but I believe it's not right. And so, and then they'll say, yeah, but Abraham gave a tenth. Yes, he did. Abraham in Genesis 14 gave a tenth to Melchizedek. But he wasn't commanded to, but he gave it. We see Jacob even in Genesis 28, I believe it was, who gave a tenth. He promised, but nor was he commanded to give it. It was something that he gave of his own volition. And that's, when we talk about money, it's important. Money is a great way to worship God. Giving of things. So that's what worship is. It is giving to God, and giving of your offerings of money is a great way to give, just a great way to worship and give to God. And so there are other ways we can worship with our service and with sacrifice of our time and our talent, but also our treasure, our money. And money is like, it's just such a pure way to worship. It's like, it's just saying, here it is, God, no strings attached. Boom, I love you, praise you, all things come from you. And you just give to God. And God receives that, and he enjoys that. And, the work of the gospel, it takes money at times. People need to be supported to share the gospel. And Bibles cost money to print, and things. So, but as far as saying Christians are required to give 10%, I believe that is wrong. We are not under law. We are under grace. We are not in the old covenant. We are in new covenant. And while the Jews were required to give at least that, New Testament, you will not find a verse that says we are. Actually, New Testament, we're told to give generously, joyfully. And that's it. And so let's take that for what it's worth. That's my take on it, and but it does say that we are to support those who preach the gospel. It doesn't say how much, but it says those who preach the gospel should live from the gospel. and so that it's okay for Christian teachers, pastors, leaders who are laboring in the word and doctrine to receive money, and they should be supported, it says, but it doesn't say how much. I actually read a story recently of a pastor, I think it was in Africa, whose congregation beat him up because he bought a brand new Range Rover or Land Rover vehicle, and the church was pressured to give, and what really happened was he was fleecing the flock to pressuring him to give money to support his lavish lifestyle. And there are a lot of fakes and false prophets like that today who are fleecing the flock for their own gain and to support a lavish lifestyle. And then they'll use that lavish lifestyle as a sign of a blessing of God. See, you can have this too. And no. Christians, you give what you have purposed in your heart and what you want to give. But also keep in mind, yes, it does take money at times, but not just money. I mean, we need time. We need people. We need servants to help. Us pastors and teachers are not the only ones to be serving and being about the Lord's business. We're all called to ministry. But it does take money, and it is very important. So I would also encourage you, and I might get in trouble by saying this, is if your church is not spending the money wisely, and they're blowing it on a lot of non-essential, lavish things, then I would challenge you, and is that the best use of your funds to give to the Lord? It might be more useful to give to a missionary or a ministry where it's going to go for the furtherance of the kingdom, not for a more lavish, Americanized Christianity, where they need a more updated, fancy, smancy $20,000 camera, which they already have multiple of. Or a camera boom arm so you can get a aerial view of the pastor preaching the sermon. And do you really need that? Do you really need a pulpit that comes out of the stage and comes up out of the ground? And do you need that? Is that necessary? No, I would propose that's a waste of money. So we got to be careful who we're supporting. And this whole idea as well that we're to give to the local church as if that's the New Testament equivalent of Old Testament, and you need to give to the local church or you're in sin. No, actually the church is the people. It is not the building. The early church didn't have buildings. The church is always referred to as the people. And that's something my wife and I have always done is we've gone to churches where they didn't need our money, so we weren't going to give it. But we would support missionaries or ministries where the money would go to the front lines. And so, or people in need in the church who need help with bills and things. And we've been recipients of that offering as well. And so, to say that we're required to give to the church building also is that you will not find a scripture reference for that. The church is the people. And so I hope that helps you guys. And I encourage any feedback, any questions there. Again, this is a secondary issue. But I encourage you, give to the Lord. But you give what you purpose in your heart. And you give joyfully. You give freely out of your own volition. And it's worship to the Lord, which is a sweet smelling aroma. So love you guys. Test all things. Hold fast to what is good.